All right, we're going to go and get started. Welcome to How to Gain Admission to Stanford and Ivy League Universities. I'm Dan Lee, and I'm one of the co-founders and also a senior admissions consultant at Solomon Admissions Consulting. So at Solomon Admissions Consulting, we have the largest team of former Ivy League and other top school admissions officers in the country. We have over 40 former Ivy League and other top 20 school admissions officers. We work as a collaboratively as a team, and we can help you on everything related to the college admissions process. Our team of over 40 admissions officers includes such individuals as the former Assistant Director of Admissions at MIT and Dartmouth, the former Director of Admissions at Cornell University, the former Senior Assistant Dean of Admission at Princeton University, the former Assistant Director of Admission at Columbia University, the former Senior Associate Director of Admissions at the University of Pennsylvania, the former Assistant Director of Admissions at the University of Chicago, the former Assistant Director of Admission at Stanford University, and the list goes on and on. So the first question to ask is why care? So Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford reject over 60% of applicants who have both a perfect 4.0 unweighted GPA and a perfect 1600 on the SAT. And Stanford in particular rejects 70% of students with perfect SAT scores. So this chart shows three different columns. So the first column, titled National Average in 2005, shows the national acceptance rate at top universities in the country 15 years ago in 2005. The second column, entitled National Average 2019, shows the acceptance rates at these universities this past year. And the third column, titled Solomon Admissions 2019, shows the acceptance rates of Solomon admissions clients who applied to these universities this past year. And keep in mind that for each school, at least 20 Solomon applicants apply to each school. In many cases, many more. And so this is a pretty sizable data set. So for example, Columbia University's acceptance rate 15 years ago in 2005 was 12%. Last year, Columbia University's acceptance rate went down by over 50% of that, which is down to 6.1%. And last year, 31.7% of Solomon admissions clients who applied to Columbia University were accepted at Columbia. In 2005, 15 years ago, the acceptance rate at Stanford was 13%. Last year, the acceptance rate at Stanford was pretty much 1/3 of that at 4.3%. And last year, 27.9% of Solomon admissions clients who applied to Stanford were admitted to Stanford University. Let's look at how elite colleges evaluate applicants. So elite colleges look at both your academic and your personal profile components. So roughly 25% is your SAT-1, ACT, and SAT-2 subject test scores. And a lot of students underestimate the importance of the SAT-2 subject tests. At most top schools, they are as important, if not more important, than the SAT-1. Another 25% are your grades, your class rank, and your course difficulty or rigor. And course rigor simply looks at the number of AP and honors courses that you've taken. And the other 50% is improvable at the time of the application. So 25% includes your personal statement, your supplemental essays, which have to be tailored to what every top school looks for. So if you're applying to UPenn, what does UPenn look for? UPenn looks for students who take an interdisciplinary approach to academics. So you have to show how your background fits with that interdisciplinary approach. If you're applying to Brown University, what does Brown look for? Brown looks for students who want academic freedom through the open curriculum. And so you have to show how your background fits with the mission of what Brown is looking for. And so, and also an addendum. So if you have any type of academic anomalies in your background, such as a bad semester or a few too many B's on your transcript, that has to be explained in the additional information section of the common application. And another 25% consists of your activity sheet, your interviews, and your recommendation letters. Let's talk about test optional colleges in light of COVID. So a question we get a lot is, is standardized testing such as the SAT and the ACT really optional at test optional colleges in light of COVID? So test optional colleges include a lot of the top colleges, places like Harvard, Princeton, Dartmouth. And the answer is not really if you want to be a truly competitive candidate. So given two equivalent candidates, one who has strong testing and the other who has no testing, the applicant with strong testing will look much more attractive. And keep in mind that your peers who submit strong testing will have a leg up on you in the admissions process. So think of testing as a way to stand out and differentiate yourself from your competitors during a time when a lot of people are either unable or unwilling to take the SAT because they think it's really optional when it's not. And keep in mind that the SAT and the ACT are definitely not optional if your GPA falls below the 25th percentile GPA of admitted applicants at a school. And so if your GPA falls below the 25th percentile, then you need to score on the SAT or the ACT the 75th percentile score for admitted applicants or above at that school. So the 75th percentile admitted SAT score at most Ivies is going to be right around a 1570. It's going to vary slightly here and there, but it's going to be right around a 1570. And we always tell students, if a test center is closed due to COVID-19, sign up for a test center in a neighboring state and drive there to take it. It's really that important. It's only optional if you don't want to get in. So how does Stanford evaluate applicants? So at Stanford, like most top schools, they recalculate your GPA. And so at Stanford in particular, they focus on your grades from 10th and 11th grade only. And freshman grades are not as important. They look at your academic core courses only. So what does that mean? That means history, English, science, math, foreign language, and it can include other academic subjects like computer science and programming. They do not look at your grades in PE, typing, band, or orchestra. And Stanford in particular uses flat grading to recalculate your GPA. So what that means is that an A- on your transcript becomes an A, which is great if you have an A-. And conversely, a B+ gets downgraded to a B, which is not great if you have a B+. Let's look at the Stanford applicant rating system. So Stanford assigns every applicant 6 separate ratings on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the highest, 5 being the lowest. And they also assign you an overall rating on a 1 to 5 scale. So at Stanford, they assign you an academic grades and GPA rating on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the highest. They assign you a testing rating on a 1 to 5 scale. They assign you an extracurricular rating on a 1 to 5 scale. And Stanford, like all top schools, looks for very angular students. They're not looking for well-rounded students. I bolded this one. This is probably one of the most important ratings, if not the most important rating at Stanford. They look at your intellectual vitality rating on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the highest. And I'll explain what that means later as we go into depth into exploring what the IV rating means. They also give you a recommendations rating on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the highest. And they give you a self-presentation and essay rating on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the highest. So Stanford also assigns every applicant an overall rating on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the highest, 5 being the lowest, with plus or minus. So for instance, a 1- would be lower than a 1. A rating of 1, what that means is that this person is a clear admit, and these applicants are obviously very rare. And oftentimes these are students who have an intellectual vitality rating of 1, and we'll talk about what intellectual vitality means later. And so a student with an academic rating, with an overall rating of 1 is a clear admit, and they will be admitted. So students with a rating of 2, our overall rating, are competitive and well within range to be admitted. So this is roughly about 10% of the applicant pool at Stanford. And so students with an overall rating of 2 are compelling and will be given serious consideration by the admissions committee. A student with an overall rating of 3 falls short of compelling and is much less likely to be admitted. And this is the overall rating of 3, that's where most competitive students fall. A student with an overall rating of 4 is not compelling and will be a deny unless there's a hook. And a student with an overall rating of 5 is not competitive at all and is a very easy deny. So let's look at the rating of this is the most common profile of a rejected Stanford applicant. So this is rejected applicant would have an overall rating of 3. and they would have an academic grades GPA rating of 2 to 3. And what that means is they probably have a few too many B's on their transcript. They would have a testing rating of 1 to 2, which means they have incredibly high testing, probably in the 99th percentile. They would have an extracurricular rating of 3 to 4, which means they're well-rounded, not angular. They would have an intellectual vitality rating of 3 to 4, which means they have, we'll go into that later, but what that means is they probably have not done extensive research with the professor outside the classroom. They would have a recommendations rating of 3 to 4 as well, and they would have a self-presentation and essay rating of 2 to 3, and an overall rating of 3. So this is the profile of the most common type of rejected applicant at Stanford. So let's look at the most common profile of an admitted Stanford applicant. So this person would have an overall rating of 1 to 2. And so their academic grades and GPA rating would be a 1 to 2. So much stronger than the prior applicant, the prior profile of the most common rejected applicant, where their most common academic grades GPA rating is a 2 to 3. They would have a testing rating of 1 to 2, which is very comparable to the prior applicant. They would have an extracurricular rating of 1 to 3, which means they're very angular and not well-rounded. They would have an intellectual vitality rating of 1 to 3, and we'll discuss what that means later. And they would have a recommendations rating of 2 to 3, and they would have a self-presentation / essay rating of 1 to 2, and so that they would have an overall rating of 1 to 2. So let's talk about the intellectual vitality rating of 1 at Stanford. So this is what the intellectual vitality rating of 1, which is the highest intellectual vitality rating at Stanford, would look like. This student is somebody who would have done academic research outside the classroom with a college professor, leading to published research in a journal. This student would have substantial work on founding and developing a nonprofit 501c3 related to their area of academic passion. This student would have written a very strong Stanford intellectual vitality supplemental essay. And this student would show a true love of learning for the sake of learning at a high level outside the classroom, which would be reinforced by the recommendation letters. So when Stanford is looking at intellectual vitality, they're asking a couple questions. So the first thing they're asking is, does the applicant take ownership of his or her education outside the classroom? Is the applicant the kind of student who would enrich the learning of other Stanford students? And is the applicant passionate about learning? Because let's be honest, the majority of straight A students are not really passionate about learning. So let's take a look at the Stanford intellectual vitality supplemental essay. So Stanford asks 3 supplemental essays. The first one is the intellectual vitality essay, which is by far the most important supplement at Stanford. The second one is a note to your roommate, which is also known as the good roommate test. And the third essay at Stanford is what matters to you, why. And so we're looking at the most important essay at Stanford, which is the intellectual vitality essay. So the prompt is, the Stanford community is deeply curious and driven to learn in and out of the classroom. Reflect on an idea or experience that makes you genuinely excited about learning. And this can be up to 250 words. So I call this the never-ending dinner conversation essay. So they're looking for students who can talk about an intellectual topic for hours on end and be really, really excited about it. So who does Stanford weed out using this question? Stanford weeds out perfect students who are not intellectuals, who get perfect grades and test scores for the sake of getting into Stanford and getting a high-paying job, not because they love learning. And so this question is really testing whether you love learning for the sake of learning or for the sake of getting into Stanford. And so a bad answer to this question talks about Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, which many applicants use to study for the AP US History exam. Once again, Stanford is not looking for students who study to get perfect grades and test scores to get into Stanford. They're looking for students who love learning. So a great answer to this question addresses one intellectual idea which reveals your love of learning far beyond the classroom walls for the sake of learning, and one idea that can be translated to undergraduate research and academic publication at Stanford and is hopefully related to your academic major or future career goals. Let's look at some of the differences between Stanford and the Ivies. So unlike the Ivies, Stanford tends to admit the most compelling applicant, not necessarily the most qualified applicant on paper. So if you look at our Solomon success rates, last year the acceptance rate at Stanford was 4%, over 27% of Solomon clients who applied to Stanford got into Stanford. And that's about 6 to 7x the normal acceptance rate. And the reason it's so high is because Stanford tends to look for the most compelling applicant. And so that really comes down to how you strategically position your application and max out the ratings that Stanford looks for. So Stanford tends to weigh the SAT less than the Ivies. And so Stanford is the type of school that if you have ones across the board on everything else, but your testing is a little bit lower, that's not as big a problem as it is at the Ivies. They weigh the supplemental essays more heavily than the Ivies. They also weigh athletic recruiting more heavily than the Ivies. Stanford also assigns every applicant a separate intellectual vitality rating, which is not the case at some Ivies. And they do not give you as big a boost to early action applicants as the Ivies do. And Stanford also tends to favor public school students over private. How do Ivy League schools evaluate applicants? Let's look at the Ivy League applicant rating system. So Ivy League schools assign every applicant 2 separate ratings on varying scales, but it's often on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the lowest, 5 the highest. We'll use Dartmouth as an example. So at Dartmouth, the applicant rating system is as follows. They give you 2 ratings, an academic rating 1 to 5, 1 is the lowest, 5 is the highest, and an extracurricular / personal rating on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. And they divide those 2 ratings into subscores. So the academic rating is divided into subscores for grades and GPA, 1 to 5, 5 being the highest, testing 1 to 5, 5 being the highest, intellectual qualities rating 1 to 5, and intellectual qualities rating at Dartmouth is very similar to the intellectual vitality rating at Stanford. They're almost identical. And the personal and extracurricular ratings are divided into subscores for extracurricular rating 1 to 5, looking for angular students, not well-rounded, and a personal qualities rating 1 to 5. And personal qualities, the personal qualities they look at include things such as overcoming our adversity, a commitment to social justice, etc. So let's take a look at what an academic rating of 5 out of 5, which is the highest at Dartmouth, would look like. So this is somebody who's in the top 1 to 2% of his or her high school class in terms of class rank. This student would have taken the most challenging course load of AP courses. This student would have SAT, ACT, and SAT2 subject test scores in the 99th percentile. This student would have glowing letters of recommendation indicating the student is the best out of applicants from the past several years from his or her high school. This student would show an intense level of learning as evidenced by academic research outside the classroom with a college professor, leading to publication in a journal. And this student would have the potential to be a leader in his or her academic field in the future. Let's take a look at what an academic rating of 3 out of 5 at Dartmouth would look like. So this is a student who's not going to be very competitive for admission. So this student would be in the top 5 to 10% of his or her high school class. This student would have taken the most challenging course load of AP courses. This student would have SAT, ACT, and SAT2 subject test scores above the 95th percentile. This student would have strong but unexceptional letters of recommendation. And this student really lacks the intense level of learning of academic 5s, with maybe some independent reading outside the classroom, but no published research with a college professor. And this student is often driven to achieve more by competition than by true love of learning. And so this describes most straight A students who apply to Ivy League schools. Let's take a look at what an extracurricular or personal rating of 5 out of 5, which is the highest at Dartmouth, would look like. So Dartmouth, like all Ivies, is looking for extremely angular students. They're not looking for well-rounded students. So these would be individual examples of students who would have the highest personal or extracurricular rating at Dartmouth. So examples would include someone who's a published author, someone who's an Intel or Regeneron STS finalist, which is the top 40 in the country, someone who's an Olympic medalist, someone who's soloed at Carnegie Hall, someone who qualified for the USMO, somebody who has awards at the national level, and someone who has a patent pending, obviously without parental involvement. Let's take a look at what an extracurricular personal rating of 3 out of 5 at Dartmouth or the Ivies would look like. And keep in mind, a 3 out of 5 is somebody who's not going to be very competitive unless there's something else that's extraordinary in their application. So this would be somebody who's well-rounded, someone who has awards at the regional level, significant commitment at a high level to a few activities. Examples include student body president, all-state orchestra, captain of a varsity sports team, nationally ranked debater. And this student is well-rounded and involved, but not the most passionate about anything. And so the phrase we like to use is the jack of all trades, the master of none. These students have a very, very hard time getting into any Ivy League school. So let's talk about the separate engineering admissions process at certain Ivy League schools. So at Columbia, Cornell, and UPenn, there's a separate engineering admissions process. So what that means is that, number one, engineering faculty are on the admissions committee, and engineering faculty really, really love numbers, as you can imagine. So because of that, there's a greater emphasis on grades and test scores, and there's also a greater emphasis on academic research in engineering, as well as engineering internships. So this is a very important question and topic to consider. So should I apply early decision or early action by the November 1st deadline? And the answer to that question is unequivocally yes. So most Ivy League and other top universities fill approximately 50% or half the available seats in their incoming freshman class through early decision or early action applicants who submit their application by November 1st. So the advantage conferred by applying early decision or early action is the equivalent of adding about 150 points to your SAT score. And early decision and early action applicants at schools not named Harvard, Stanford, Yale, and Princeton compete against a much weaker applicant pool. Keep in mind, this year, Princeton actually got rid of restrictive early action. And so for this particular year, only Harvard, Stanford, and Yale have early action. And what I mean by that is college admissions is a top-down model. And so if you apply restrictive early action to Harvard, you're competing against the strongest students in the country. And so the early action pool at Harvard is much, much stronger than the regular decision pool because it consists of the strongest students in the country. On the other hand, if you're applying binding early decision to Duke, the early decision pool at Duke is actually much, much weaker than the regular decision pool at Duke because the ED pool at Duke means you're not competing against all the people who are applying early action to Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Columbia, MIT, et cetera, you know? And so because of that, you're just competing against a much weaker pool of people for early decision at a place like Duke. Your application is read much more closely since there's more time to read each application. And borderline applicants who are waitlisted regular decision would have gotten in had they applied early decision or early action in many cases. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're working with us and we tell you you have no shot at Yale. You have no shot early action at Yale or regular decision, but if you apply early decision to Dartmouth, you're going to get in. And let's say you ignore us and you apply early action to Yale anyways and you get rejected. And then let's say you apply regular decision to Dartmouth, which is much harder to get into than early decision. And so you apply regular decision to Dartmouth, you're waitlisted. So what that means is since you applied RD to Dartmouth and were waitlisted, had you applied early decision to Dartmouth like we told you to, you would have most likely gotten in. That's what that means. Let's look at early decision and restrictive early action at Ivy League schools. So the first column shows the ED or EA acceptance rate at each Ivy this past year. The second column shows the regular decision acceptance rate at the Ivies this past year. And the third column shows the percent of the freshman class filled through early decision or early action admits. And as you can see, the percent is, you know, close to half in most cases. So for instance, at Brown University last year, the early decision acceptance rate at Brown was 17.5%. The regular decision acceptance rate at Brown was less than 1/3 of that at 5.4%. And Brown filled 38% of the seats in its incoming freshman class through early decision. At Yale last year, the restrictive early action acceptance rate was 13.8%. The regular decision acceptance rate was 5.1%, which is much lower. And it's unclear what percent of the freshman class was filled through restrictive early action at Yale because restrictive early action is non-binding. Let's talk about strategic positioning and crafting one's narrative. So what is strategic positioning? Strategic positioning is a fancy term for making you stand out at a school. And so what you're doing is you're positioning your strengths against the institution's weaknesses for the purpose of standing out. So if any of you watch tennis or are fans of tennis and you like Rafa Nadal and Roger Federer and you like watching them play, when the two of those, when Nadal plays Federer, what happens a lot is Nadal structures points that go from his lefty forehand to Federer's weaker one-handed backhand. What he tries to do is he tries to break down Federer's weaker one-handed backhand. So he's pitting his strength against Federer's weakness for the purpose of winning the point. So the analogy in college admissions is you're pitting strength against weakness for the purpose of getting in. So an example of that is that it's much more advantageous for somebody who's an engineering whiz with science awards to market his or her strong engineering background to Yale, where not as many engineering majors apply, versus marketing it to MIT, where he or she would blend into the crowd and be a dime a dozen. So admissions committees are building a class, and this is very important to keep in mind. Top colleges are looking to build a well-rounded incoming class composed of students who are not well-rounded. Let me say that again. Top colleges are looking to build a well-rounded incoming class composed of students who are not well-rounded, but who are specialists. And so the key question is, who are you going to be in the incoming class? And what talent or perspective do you bring to the incoming class that no one else brings? And do you have the potential to be a future leader in your chosen academic field? These are the questions that admissions officers are subconsciously asking when evaluating your application. So let's look at a very simplistic example. So most applicants who come to Solomon Admissions are well-rounded, and so that's problematic. So if an applicant is a well-rounded student with great numbers, the admissions committees at top schools typically don't like admitting well-rounded students into their incoming class. They want students who are really focused on one or two areas in Angular. And so the strategy would be to center your personal statement on a singular passion or intellectual pursuit that makes you seem more focused. And so think of your high school career as 300 hours of footage that you're shooting for a 1-hour documentary. And depending on how you splice those 300 hours down to 1 hour, you can either make yourself look well-rounded or angular, and you want to do the latter. Let's look at some common case studies. So case study number one is the undeclared major applicant. So these are all case studies of students we've worked with at Solomon Admissions who are our clients. And so this particular student was a white male applicant from a public high school. He came to us junior year, and he had a 3.7 GPA, taking a very light course load. He had only taken one AP course his first 2 years of high school, which is considered extremely light. He had a 33 on the ACT, which is considered an average to slightly below average score at the top schools. He was an avid thespian, so he did theater, and he had no extracurricular activities outside of theater when he came to us, and he was completely undecided on his major. And so the strategic positioning we use for the student is we help the student discover his interest in linguistics through theater. Linguistics is a undersubscribed major at all schools, and so they're always looking for students who have a strong background in linguistics. So what we did is we assisted the student in finding research with a linguistics professor over the summer, and that increases intellectual vitality rating, obviously. And we also suggested that the student found a nonprofit to show leadership and initiative, which he did, and he founded several chapters of that nonprofit. We also had the student submit a theater supplement for his application, and the outcome is that he was accepted at the University of Chicago, Georgetown, and NYU. So let's look at case study number two. This is the recruited athlete. So this student we worked with, she came to us senior year of high school. She was a white female applicant from a private high school. She had a 3.6 GPA, which is very low, and she had a 2080 out of 2400 on the SAT, which is also considered low. She was a talented track runner, and she was recruited by several Division I schools, and she was well-rounded extracurricularly and undecided on her major. And so the strategic positioning we used for her is that the student wanted to initially write her application about sports and was undecided on a major. So we advised against writing about sports because the application that admissions committees don't like from athletes is what's called the cliche athlete's essay and application. And so it talks about the winning shot in sports and what that taught you about life. They get thousands of those essays and they don't like those. So instead, we had her write her entire application about her leadership pursuits and interest in mathematics and physics to showcase what she would bring to the campus outside of sports. We positioned her as a physics major since women are underrepresented in physics, and the outcome is that she was accepted early to the College of William and Mary, which was her top choice. So case study number 3 is a student with no extracurricular activities. So this particular student came to us senior year. She was a white female applicant from a public high school. She had a 3.9 GPA taking a light course load, very few AP courses. She had a 30 on the ACT, which is considered extremely low at the top schools. And she had no extracurricular activities. So she really only spent her summers vacationing in Europe and visiting museums and shows in Paris and London. She had no extracurricular activities and she was undecided on her major. And so generally speaking, students with no extracurricular activities, even if they have a 3.9 GPA, are not competitive at top 30 schools. And so for this particular student, what we did is we used the student's interest in art through visiting famous art galleries around the world to position her as an art history major. Art history is an undersubscribed major at every top school, and her application talked about different pieces of art that she had seen around the world and how that would translate to her major in art history. And the outcome is that she was accepted at USC and NYU. Let's talk about major specific case studies. So case study number 1 is the Premed Applicant. We work with a lot of students who are Premed, and unless they're applying to a combined BSMD program, we almost never market them as Premed. And so there are many pitfalls of this applicant. So first off, there are too many applicants who are Premed, and colleges want a diversity of academic interests in their incoming freshman class, not an entire class filled with future doctors. And so I always tell students, you're not applying to medical school, you're applying to a 4-year liberal arts education, and they don't really want to hear why you want to be a doctor. And so this student often has a generic extracurricular profile. They would have done medical research at a university for a summer. They would have volunteered in the emergency room at a hospital, and they would have your standard medical volunteering and clinical experiences. And once again, you're not applying to med school, so nobody cares why you want to be a doctor. Do not talk about it in your application unless you want to be rejected. So let's take a look at a student that we worked with who was pre-med. So this student came to us basically at the end of junior year, right before her senior year, and she was an Asian female applicant from a highly ranked and hyper competitive public high school. She had a perfect 4.0 GPA taking the most rigorous AP courses. She had a 23 out of 20 out of 2,400 on the SAT. She had done medical research at a university for 1 summer, but no publications or awards. She did science Olympiad. She volunteered at the hospital. She did varsity cross country. She was good at drawing, and so what we did is we actually had her submit an art supplement to Stanford and the other top schools she was applying to. And she had a few smaller leadership positions, and she wanted to major in human biology at Stanford, which is the most popular pre-med major at Stanford. And so for strategic positioning, you know, human biology or hum bio is one of the most oversubscribed majors at Stanford and is considered pre-med central. And obviously Asian females are highly overrepresented in the pre-med arena. So instead of positioning her as a pre-med, what we did is we removed the hospital volunteering experience from our activity sheet in our application. And instead we position her as an art history major instead. Once again, art history is an undersubscribed major at all top schools. And this student had perfect grades in her history and her art courses. And we also had her submit a strong art supplement. And we also had her do a independent research project on art history, where she wrote a history paper on art history and got it published. And she submitted that as a supplement to strengthen her intellectual vitality in her application. And the outcome is that she was accepted at Stanford. And once you get into Stanford, you can declare any major you want. Let's look at case study number 2. This is the computer science or engineering applicant. So we work with a lot of students who want to do computer science. In most cases, we do not market them as a computer science applicant because there are many pitfalls of this applicant. Number 1, there are too many applicants who are interested in computer science and engineering. And once again, colleges want a diversity of academic interests in their incoming freshman class. This student would also have a generic extracurricular profile. They would have done robotics. If they're female, they would have done Girls Who Code. They would have taken AP Computer Science and done well on the AP Computer Science exam. They would have had a tech internship at their parents' tech company. They would have self-taught themselves multiple programming languages, and they would have possibly created an app for the smartphone. And this is especially bad positioning for the most overrepresented students in this field, who are East Asian and South Asian male applicants. So if you're East Asian or South Asian and you're male and you want to study computer science, in most cases, you don't actually want to check computer science in the application, because that's really, really going to hurt your chances of getting it. So let's take a look at a case study of a student we worked with who wanted to study computer science. So this student came to us junior year. He was an Indian male from a top boarding school. He had all A's, taking the most rigorous AP courses with only 2 B's. He had a 35 on the ACT. He did the robotics club. He had a 5 on the AP computer science exam. He had self-taught himself multiple programming languages. He played tennis, chess club, speech and debate. He did independent research project in linguistics, which we had him do later on. And he had no research or major awards for computer science, and he wanted to major in computer science at Harvard. And so this is a Indian male applicant who has a very average to below average computer science profile. And so the strategic positioning we use is that obviously CS is super oversubscribed, and Indian males are the most overrepresented in computer science and engineering and face the highest bar to entry into the top CS programs. So what we did is we repositioned this student. This student has an interest in languages as well. So we repositioned the student as a computational linguistics major. And so computational linguistics is an area of linguistics where you apply computer science to the study of language. And so we set the student up with a research opportunity with a computational linguistics professor over the summer. And he ended up presenting his research at several conferences. And he was able to apply his CS background to studying problems in linguistics. And we also had him apply to every school as a linguistics major, which is undersubscribed. And he wrote his entire application about linguistics and philosophy. And the outcome is that he was accepted at Harvard and Cornell. And once you're accepted, you can simply just declare computer science as your major. Let's look at case study number 3. This is the business/economics/investment banking applicant. So a lot of the students we work with want to be investment bankers on Wall Street, and so we send them to the target schools for investment banking. But there are several pitfalls of this applicant. So number one, most top colleges do not have an undergraduate business major. So Harvard, no undergraduate business major. Duke, no undergraduate business major. Stanford, no undergraduate business major. Dartmouth, no undergraduate business major. The list goes on and on. So talking about your interest in business is not helpful at most top schools, because you can't even study business. And so the last thing that admissions officers want to read about is an application about a student who wants to study economics or business, get an investment banking job on Wall Street and get rich. So I mean, that's a fine goal to have in life, but you just don't want to talk about it in the application. And keep in mind that you're not applying to an MBA program, you're applying to a 4-year liberal arts education. Nobody wants to hear about you working at a large bulge bracket bank on Wall Street and making a lot of money. So let's look at a client that we worked with who wanted to do investment banking and private equity. And so this client came to us late junior year. He was an Indian male from a private high school. He had all A's, taking the most rigorous AP courses. He had a 2340 out of 2400 on the SAT. He was a nationally ranked policy debater. He was an Eagle Scout. He had no business experience. And he wanted to enter the dual Jerome Fisher M&T or Management and Technology program at UPenn Wharton to study both business and engineering. And keep in mind, the M&T program at Wharton, for those of you who are not familiar, is the most elite dual program at Wharton, where you get a dual degree in business and engineering. And the M&T program at Wharton at UPenn is harder to get into than Harvard and Stanford. And he wanted to eventually work at a private equity firm on Wall Street. So the strategic positioning we use for the student is the M&T program at UPenn looks for really 3 things. They look for students with a strong quantitative background. What does that mean? That means all A's in your math and your statistics courses, 800s across the board on the SATs in math too, and all your math subjects. They look for an interdisciplinary approach to academics. So what does that mean? That means combining different areas of academics like business and engineering and the humanities. And they look for students who have an entrepreneurial spirit. And so that doesn't necessarily mean starting your own business, but you have to start something to show that you're entrepreneurial. So when the student came to us, he had a strong quantitative background, obviously, did not have an interdisciplinary approach to academics, and he did not do anything entrepreneurial. So we had to correct that. So what we did is we set the student up with a research opportunity with an industrial engineering and operations research professor. and that's for the purpose of strengthening his quantitative background and his interdisciplinary approach. So for those of you who are not familiar with industrial engineering and operations research, it's an area of engineering that combines business, engineering, statistics, and sometimes even the humanities. And so it's highly interdisciplinary. And then we also had the student start a nonprofit to show that he's entrepreneurial. And then he spent his application to M&T talking about wanting to combine his public policy experience through being a nationally ranked policy debater with his quantitative background to start a public policy think tank in Washington, D.C., which showed that he's entrepreneurial. And so his entire application talked about how, he wanted to apply his public policy background and combine that with big data and engineering to be a public policy to start a public policy think tank in DC. And so he combined really all his interests and addressed the elements that the M&T program was looking for. And the outcome is that he was accepted at the Jerome Fisher M&T program, and he's currently working in private equity in New York. So let's look at case study number 4. This is the combined BSMD applicant. And so this applicant is very, very similar to the Premed applicant. And so there are many pitfalls of this applicant. And keep in mind, for those of you who are not familiar with combined BSMD programs, these are 7 or 8 year programs, in some cases even 6-year programs, where you get into both college and medical school straight out of high school. They're very, very difficult to get into. And the admissions criteria is very similar to getting into medical school. And so number 1, too many applicants are pre-med, and colleges want a diversity of academic interest in their incoming freshman class. They don't want an entire freshman class filled with future doctors. And you have to be accepted to both the undergraduate college and to the BSMD program. So if you're applying to the hardest BSMD program to get into in the country, which is the PLME program at Brown or the program in liberal medical education, you have to be accepted to both Brown undergrad and PLME at Brown. So what does Brown undergrad look for? They look for students who want academic freedom through the open curriculum. And so you have to show a fit with that philosophy as well as a fit with the Alpert School of Medicine at Brown, And so you really have multiple things that you have to look at. And keep in mind that if you're applying to both BSMD programs and elite Ivies that don't have BSMD programs, then you must market yourself differently for non-BSMD programs. So for places like Harvard and Stanford that don't have BSMD programs, you can't talk about wanting to be a doctor because that's very cliche. And then for the combined BSMD programs, it's all about why you want to be a doctor, but you got to push it beyond that because you have to have a unique and compelling mission in medicine, because they want to know why you want to go to medicine, and we'll talk about that later, but you have to have a compelling reason for why you want to go into medicine. So let's look at a combined BSMD applicant we work with who also wanted to apply to the top Ivies in Stanford. And so this student came to us senior year. I'll give you her profile. She's an Asian female from a public high school. She had a perfect 4.0 GPA taking the most rigorous AP courses. She had a 34 on the ACT. She had national awards for research on environmental issues. She had founded clubs promoting interest in STEM and conservation. She was a hospital volunteer, and she wanted to apply to both the top Ivy, Stanford, and to the PLME program at Brown, which is the hardest BSMD program to get into in the country. And so for her positioning, so for the top Ivies, we obviously removed the hospital volunteering experience from the activity sheet in the application, because that would hurt her. Instead, we marketed her as an environmental engineering major, since everything else being equal, female applicants are twice as likely to be admitted to engineering as equally qualified male applicants of the same ethnicity. And the application addressed her interest in conservation and environmental engineering. And then for the PLME program at Brown, it's obviously all about why you want to be a doctor. So we market this student as someone who wants to practice rural medicine, because there's a high demand for students who want to be country doctors. So every top med school looks for students who want to be family physicians in rural areas. And the reason for that is, nobody wants to move to North Dakota and practice medicine. And there's a shortage of doctors in places like North Dakota. And so the outcome is that she was accepted at the PLME program at Brown, and she was also accepted at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. And if you're curious where she chose to go to Stanford. So at Solomon Admissions Consulting, we provide extensive one-on-one counseling from a very large team of over 40 former admissions officers at Ivy League and other top schools. We help you out from everything from A to Z. and we start working with students in 7th, 8th grade up to junior year and senior year of high school. Here's a sampling of some of our acceptance letters from this past year from our students. We ask our students to send us their acceptance letters. Some of them do it, not all of them. And obviously, we've redacted their names to preserve confidentiality. So if you have any questions about college admissions or your profile, I would strongly encourage you to set up a free consultation with us. You can reach out to us either by phone at 646-598-8174, or you can shoot us an email at info@solomonadmissions.com. And this free consultation is a great opportunity for you to get feedback on your profile, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and what we could potentially do to help you become a stronger applicant at these schools.